Hey guys, this is your High Fist here with another juicy topic. As always, thank you to Steven Erickson for sharing and almost commenting on my last video. In fact, he did get a certain blithering idiot to take shots at me, thereby proving my thesis. So, thank you, Mr. Erickson, for that. So, today's video is going to be quite short, guys. The tragedy of immortality in the 10 big books. There's a saying in my mother tongue Tamil which goes like Saga Varampol Soga Mundo, which roughly translates to is there anything more tragic than immortality? And the 10 big books explores this question through a variety of characters and storylines. And it's this thread that we will be discussing today. And I think it's an interesting discussion because typically, both in fantasy and in mythology, we've seen things like immortality and eternal life being things that most people covet, that great wars and battles are fought for. I know there are exceptions, there are always exceptions, but for the most part in fantasy and mythology, immortality is really seen as this cool and desired power, right? Things like eternal life, invulnerability, as I said, are seen as gifts rather than curses. And while other authors have certainly subverted this as well, Erickson gives us so many case studies and examples and so many different angles to the question that it's almost a library on its own. So in this video, we will be looking at some of the cases where this theme of immortality being a curse was explored. I want to start this by looking at a great exchange of dialogue between Spite and Crocus in Toll the Hounds, where Spite encapsulates just how sad the life of an immortal can truly be. So they arrive in Darujistan and marvel at its beauty, right? Because obviously Darujistan is this great capitalist beacon of prosperity and wealth. And as they are gazing at it, Spite says, and I quote, "A long life teaches one just how ephemeral is such thriving glory. Why, I have come again upon cities I knew well in the age of their greatness, only to find crumbled walls, dust, and desolation." End quote. So she has lived for so long that she's visited many cities around the world that thrive and shine just like Darujistan. But when she visits it later on, the age of that civilization is done, that epoch is over, and all she finds are ruins because she's that old. Crocus doesn't understand this because he's a mortal, and more importantly because he's an idiot. And he arrogantly says, oh, Darujistan has stood for 2000 years and it will stand for another 2000 years. And Spite just looks at him and says, precisely. Because to her, 2000 years is nothing. She knows that the next time she comes here will probably be a few millennia later. And by then, Darujistan will be long gone. And she then adds something even more telling. She says, I quote again, "Consider the weariness that often afflicts your kind late in their lives. Then multiply that countless times. This is the burden of being long-lived." End quote. So she basically says, you know how you mortals become grumpy and miserable in your old age? Multiply that by infinity. And that's how we feel. That's how grumpy and miserable we are. And it's not just Spite either, right? We see this as a recurring pattern with many of the gods where their longevity itself becomes their problem. We see the elder gods starting to resent their own immortality and the fact that they have to watch these new warrens and new gods and new magic systems emerge to take their place, and there's absolutely nothing they can do about it except scheme pointlessly because you can't really reverse the tides of time, right? And they can't just die either. We see gods who are forgotten and who've essentially lost the will to live, like that weird bear god which saves Samadev's life in Toll the Hounds. is just forgotten and lonely and sad, and it can't even wither away like a mortal animal would because it's a god. We even see the most prominent gods like Kurul and especially Mael actively trying to escape the drudgery and tedium that comes with being immortal. In their own way, they're all looking for a release from this boredom of immortality, of existence. Speaking of boredom, we see this with Anamander Rake and the tea standee as well, where their lifespans are so long that life itself seems devoid of all meaning to them. And they're also depressed to the point where their own leader has to purposely get his head chopped off by Dazi Multor, right? I mean, most leaders usually spend their time trying to avoid decapitation, trying to avoid the guillotine or the executioner's axe. But these guys are so depressed that even Rake has no choice but to essentially commit suicide, so that these people will now feel like they have some sense of purpose. His sword Dragnipur is another great example of the tragedy of immortality. The reason it's considered such a cruel weapon is because you don't die. You live forever as a prisoner inside the sword. Remember that scene with Whiskey Jack and Rake, where Rake is about to kill a bunch of tennis cowrie women and Whiskey Jack stops him and he kills all the women instead? Remember that? That's because he considered being killed by Dragnipur to be too harsh a fate, because it doesn't really kill them. Of course, being trapped in Dragnipur consists of a lot more than just your soul being trapped in there forever. It also means you're literally a slave pulling a carriage for the rest of eternity. But Whiskey Jack didn't know all that. He simply considered it unbelievably cruel because they don't just die, they get trapped in it forever. They are immortal in it, in a sense, forever. And that's not the only instance either. Look at the Azath houses. The most brutal thing about an Azath house is that once you get taken in as its guardian or its prisoner, you're essentially there forever. And time doesn't really pass, so you don't age in it either. It's like solitary confinement as a punishment, except you're immortal, so the burden of it once again has to be multiplied times infinity, right? Look at the Aimas, another example. I've done an entire video on them and their collective madness, so you can check out that for more info. But for our purposes here, what's important is that their immortality, while meant originally to give them power, ultimately turned out to be the biggest curse. And in Memories of Ice, their version of a happy ending by the time the book ends was where they could be mortal again in that dream, where they could once again live like regular people. They figuratively drank the elixir of life, they got the immortality that they wanted, and all they got in return for it was suffering. I'm sure you guys remember scenes like the beheaded Aimas with Casa or the one with Pearl, where all they ask as a favor is oblivion. Because to an immortal, that is the ultimate reward and rest for the tedious immortality to finally end. Even with the Aimas, we see people suffering from immortality bestowed in different ways. Ondrak turns Kilava immortal by painting her, but he knows that she's suffering because of it, and he even speculates that perhaps the whole thing has made her mad because she killed her own kin to avoid the ritual. And then you have Ondrak's lover, who eventually becomes Shaik, who's essentially immortal as well because of her rage at being betrayed by Ondrak. So it's this weird immortal love triangle almost, where one lives forever because of the ritual, one because of a cave painting, and one because of a need for vengeance. And they're all absolutely miserable because of it. Another example is Kalor. Once again, check out my Kalor video for more information on him. But here too we have a character where immortality is literally the curse that's put on him. While most supervillains in fiction want to live forever, his punishment is that he lives forever. And everyone in the Malazan universe more or less seems to agree that it's a really brutal punishment. And Callot too has many great lines and quotes about the tedium of immortality, where you're just doomed to see everything and everyone you love grow old and die while you remain the same. It's a life where you can't love, you can't hope, you can't dream, because you know that everything around you will inevitably crumble while you stay the same. The most brutal example of this is probably roulade. I'm thinking of a video that focuses just on roulade, so let me know if you would be interested in that. But roulade's immortality is, once again, as you know, a massive curse. It eats away at his sanity, it pulls him away from his family, it turns him into this paradox where on the one hand he's the deliverer of midnight tides, this immortal tyrant, but on the other hand it also turns him into a lonely kid who gets easily manipulated by the clever ones around him. The immortality essentially strips him of his humanity and turns him into nothing but a vessel of pain. And finally, we have the ultimate vessel of pain, the crippled god, who in many ways serves as the pinnacle of this sort of critique of immortality. Once again, I need to plug my crippled god video. You can watch that if you want to know more about his secret identity. But he's such a pivotal character for this theme because he just needs to die and this entire story will be done. He just needs to die and we can get a happy ending. But the gods don't let him die. They keep him immortal. They keep chaining him and using his power and ensuring that he's alive. And finally, Cotillion, whom I also have a video on, by the way, Cotillion killing Camisod becomes the ultimate act of mercy because now the guy is dead and can finally go back home. Once again, his immortality, his longevity was the curse that was making him suffer this entire time. So as we can see from all these examples, guys, the Malazan books pay a lot of attention to this theme. And I'm not just talking about people like Bryce Bedict and Tok the Younger and all that who are reborn. I'm not even getting into that death is temporary type discussion, which others have already kind of explored with the 10 big books. This is purely the theme of immortality that we've explored and the many ways in which the tragedy of immortality is emphasized repeatedly in the series. It's not just a one-off thing. It's a recurring pattern throughout the books over and over again, done deliberately to make us ponder and think about something as deep as this. I could, of course, also touch on a few minor things like the Jarguth waging war on death and this becoming the defining moment of their history, them kind of resolving to defy death. We could talk about Icarium, for whom his long lifespan is an absolute curse, because if he just grew old and died like a normal person would, his misery would end, right? But instead, he has to be this killing machine, even without realizing that he's one. And he too is destined to live with companion after companion after companion who dies while he still lives. Although thankfully he himself isn't aware of it. But if you told Icarium what a threat he was and you gave him the option of killing himself, he would certainly take it because he would certainly see him living as a huge problem. So there you have it, guys, the tragedy of immortality in the 10 big books. And I'd like to end with a quote from someone I criticized earlier in this video, Crocus, because he is a fool, a blithering idiot, if you will. But he also has one of the best quotes about mortality and immortality in the series. He says, "To ascend was to surrender," meaning immortality comes with the price in these books of submitting yourself to an even higher power, where the rules were totally, completely uncertain. So he sees very clearly that immortality is not a liberation. He sees that immortality actually means slavery. It means you are now subjugated to a whole new set of cosmic laws that nobody knows or understands. And more importantly, he says, And I quote here, "Was it not a mortal's fate then to embrace life itself as one would a lover? Life with all its fraught, momentary fragility." End quote. And this really is the true encapsulation, I would say, of how Erikson sees this. The great luxury that we as mortals have is the ability to embrace life, because our lifespans actually mean something to us in a way that it simply doesn't to immortals. The concept of a lifespan actually is of significance to us. Look at the words Erikson uses in that quote that I just read before, right? And look at the deliberate use of certain words. He says, life with all its fraught, momentary fragility. As in, life is by default delicate and ephemeral. And it's the mortals, you and I, who truly get to relish this. In a sense, it's us and not the gods who truly get to embrace life and to enjoy it for what it is. So what Erikson is basically saying is, forget about the notion of happily ever after and all that. Forget about all these stories where the bad guys want immortality and the good guys want to live happily ever after and all that. None of that can or will actually happen. And if it does happen, it's not as good as you think it will be. But then he goes on to say, on a much more optimistic note, that simply because life is temporary, that doesn't make it any less valuable. What we get from Crocus's quote is that it's our mortality which helps us enjoy life. It's our mortality that helps us appreciate the important moments from our birth to our death. And in a story like the Malazan Book of the Fallen, which is all about making the readers feel a sense of universality with the world, feel a sense of commonality with fellow human beings, this is one of the most powerful messages that we get. And only a writer like Erikson can truly use our own fragility, our own impending deaths of all things, to make us feel this universality with everyone else. This is your High Fist. I hope you guys found this video enjoyable. I hope you gave it something to think about. Take care, and I'll see you guys soon.